Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker this afternoon is Chris Burns. His topic is factoring veterans into the development of a state mental health strategy plan, a South Australian perspective. Chris Burns became the South Australian Mental Health Commissioner in July 2016. He's an experienced advocate and strategic planner. Commissioner Burns is a former military officer and consultant in defence and international relations. Most recently, he was the CEO of South Australia's Defence Industry Association, successfully campaigning for the Australian Navy's next fleet of submarines and surface ships to be built in Australia. Would you kindly put your hands together for Chris Burns?
Thanks very much, Michael. Some of you would listen to that bio and wonder how the heck does a former military officer from the Army start talking to the nation about why we should build submarines and ships in Australia and end up as a mental health commissioner in a state. What the bio doesn't talk about is I had 30 years in the military, and I left the military 10 years ago, went into defence industry, but I had a lot of mates who left about the same time, and I was getting deeply disturbed about how they were being treated. They were experiencing PTSD. One indeed committed suicide. So I got quite involved in the veterans community and went on our Veterans Advisory Council and indeed chaired our Veterans Health Advisory Council. And in making the omelette of getting the ships and submarines built in Australia, I cracked a number of eggs and realised it was time I left defence industry. And when this job became available, I put my hand up. And what I'd like to do now is take you on a quick Richie Benno tour of my experiences for the last 12 months in relation to getting an understanding of mental health in the community when I had really only seen mental health through the prism of PTSD and Defence Forces. So I got the job and took the brave step of going into the state public service and had to start learning about what mental health really is. And dutifully took myself off and did a mental health first aid course and walked away from that 2 days saying, wish I'd done that 30 years ago, because there's a lot of things I would have done a whole lot differently in my life, personally and professionally, had I been empowered with that knowledge that 2-day course provided with me. But a 2-day course doesn't teach you everything in any way. My first radio interview as the Mental Health Commissioner, I got asked 2 questions. Do we have enough mental health acute beds in South Australia? And I'm an honest guy, so I answered honestly, I said, I don't know. And they said, why do mentally ill people spend so much time in our emergency departments? And keeping up the honesty thread, I said, I don't know. I'm not a clinician. I don't deal in that area. But it raised the point and stressed the point to me that the conversation in my state around mental health was really about mental illness. And it wasn't looking at mental health and wellbeing from a holistic perspective. So I went to the Premier to get my marching orders, and I said, well, what's my role? And he said, I think you might drive some reform of mental health services or something, would you? I said, I can't do that. I'm not part of the Department of Health. I'm not a clinician. You're presuming that there's something wrong with the mental health services. So I can't do that. What I'd like to do is focus on strengthening the mental wealth and the mental well-being of South Australians. He's a pretty amicable guy. He said, yeah, that'll do. Take that as a role. But he said, I want you to take an actuarial approach. He said, I want to have, what's the biggest bang for the buck can we get to make this better? To do that, I needed the data. And it was interesting that when the first person I hired was a data dude, so he got me all the figures. And it was interesting when you look at the prevalence of mental health in the community, that the clinical world focuses on that top 7 to 8%. That's where their efforts are needed. What I couldn't see was what was happening with the other 90-odd%. Indeed, if you wanted to look from an actuarial approach, you'd say, well, what are we doing about trying to cut down the numbers of people that those clinicians are having to deal with? What are we doing in that promotion, prevention and early intervention space? Part of my task is to develop a state strategic plan for mental health in the state. So I felt I had to go out and consult with the community to learn what the situation was in the state. The first thing I learned about the mental health community in South Australia was they're sick of being consulted. Worst of all, they were sick of being consulted and not listened to and not getting feedback. So I took that on right from the start. But soon after I started, the Prime Minister presented the inaugural Mental Health Award for Australia. And this is a paragraph out of his speech. And I thought it was interesting that he spoke about a huge cost. I think he got it out of order when he spoke about the measure in terms of dollars rather than human happiness. I would have said the measure in terms of human happiness before the dollars. And that we all have a vested interest in the mental health and wellbeing of our society. And he threw in that concept there, that the mental wealth of a nation. Now, having come out of industry, that resonated with me. Yes, what is the cost of mental health and wellbeing to our nation from a return on investment perspective? So I took that on board, and we went out and did the consultations. I hope this one's going to build. And we developed our approach to how we were going to approach mental wellbeing in South Australia. And the first thing we decided is that our approach was that we wanted to build, strengthen and sustain the mental health and wellbeing of South Australians. But our approach to that would be that when we look at mental wellbeing, it has to be from a whole-of-person perspective. And it's great to hear that a number of times today, because that reinforces that we might be on the right track. That you can't talk about the psychological without talking about the physiological, without talking about the environment, the community, the society around them, even indeed the economic and the spiritual side. So if you're going to take an approach to mental health and wellbeing and produce a plan about it, you better be taking that whole-of-person approach. The next thing I learnt from speaking to people in the community is it has to be whole of life. And there are various stages in our lives where we need more attention than others. The statistics were found quite stark. 45% of Australians will experience a diagnosable mental illness in their life. So I made up the next statistic. 55% of Australians will be impacted by someone who is experiencing a diagnosable mental illness. And importantly, 1 in 5, 20% of Australians at any point in time are experiencing a mental illness of some form. But 65% won't or can't access help for that illness. So that to me quite resonated. Okay, we have to deal with this from the whole of life perspective, and you know, the elderly are just as worthy and need of help as the youth. When I looked at the youth spectrum, there were some stark statistics for me. I couldn't believe that 50% of diagnosable mental illness onsets between the ages of 11 and 14. And indeed, the prevalence of mental illness decreases with age, but it's at its strongest between 18 and 24. And indeed, 75% of diagnosable mental illness onsets before the age of 24. That told me that if you want to take an actuarial approach, then if you're not doing it before someone's 25, you're probably missing the mark. The most horrific statistic for me when I looked at this, when I started, suicide accounted for 26% of deaths between the age of 15 and 24. Last week they produced new figures, it's 30% now. Second to that is vehicle accidents at 22%. And we don't know how many of those vehicle accidents are single vehicle, single occupancy, that probably were a suicide. So this is steering our thinking in terms of developing a mental health plan. Effectively, 75% of mental illness in society is onset before the age of 24. So I asked myself, what can we do to help these people, to help our youth? And it became very clear that we have to start preconception, or well before birth. Other statistics, you know, the human brain starts to develop 3 weeks after conception, and 80% of the brain's development occurs before the age of 4 years old. So if you're not focusing on that area of life, then you're going to miss the mark. And that's where our plan is starting to evolve now, where we're talking about South Australia, the next generation, and what can we do to help those kids to build up their resilience in the schools. How can we make sure that every kid in school gets the opportunity to undergo resilience training? How can we get mental health first aid courses out into the schools? And don't just think it's a health cost. It's something for other government agencies and the private sector to be involved in as well. Indeed, there's a company called Bell Communications in Canada who realised that their networks and their hardware were being used by kids to talk about mental health issues. So they started up a fund where they only take money from industry, and in the last 10 years they've raised $70 million, which has all been pumped back into youth mental health services. The next aspect of our approach to mental wellbeing is that it's whole of government. And it's not just a state government. The federal government, and you've heard it so much today with the Department of Veterans Affairs, they are strong contributors to looking after our veterans. Well, the Commonwealth and the state governments each have their own place to play, and indeed the local communities, local councils have a role to play. I did have a Lord Mayor once say to me, he said, "I can't see a role for local government in mental health in the community." I said, "Have you got a workforce?" He said, "Yeah, I've got about 150 workers." I said, "You might want to start there." And it's whole of government. And we can't just be talking about health and that top 7 to 8% of the spectrum. We've got to be talking about the education department, corrections, police, treasury. And I have all of those people represented on my steering group who guide the development of the plan. And it won't surprise you that the last part of the approach is that it's whole of community. It's not just a government issue, it's an issue for everyone, and that was very well highlighted by the Prime Minister in his speech. So I indicated we went out and we had some conversations with people and we did consultations, and the first thing I made sure we did was that we developed key themes that we identified in those consultations, and I kept a record of every person we spoke to, 2,270 people. And when we came out with the key themes, we sent those themes back out to those 2,271 people and said, did we get it right? What did we miss? Give us your priorities. What are the most important things we need to focus on? And you would assume that when we got those themes, that they would come back and say, get better mental health services, that's what we need. Get the clinical bit right and we'll be good. Well, it's not what happened. The first thing, the highest priority they afforded was the importance of the promotion, prevention and early intervention. That's what we've got to get right. And if we start to focus on that area without taking anything away from the clinical side, there will always be that demand for the clinical side, but we want to release the clinicians to do that work so that we can focus on doing that promotion, prevention and early intervention in the community. We need much greater community education. We've got to raise the awareness of people. We've got to destigmatise, and you do that through education and leadership. The whole thing about getting integrated services to work together, to get the Commonwealth and the state health services to work together, the different government agencies that have a play in the role, working together is extremely important. Access to the right care at the right place and at the right time is absolutely critical. Really borne out by the people in the rural and remote areas who said, look, really happy to understand that we can't have a psychiatrist in every town and that we have to put up with having a psychiatrist flown in every 3 weeks. But could you just make it the same psychiatrist every time so we don't have to tell our story over and over and over and over and over again? And services that better meet people's needs. And this was more about people wanting to have a choice in how they are treated, and they wanted to have alternatives to be offered to be how to treat their experience with mental illness. And targeted responses. There are specific population groups out there, and we know that veterans are one of them, just as the culturally and linguistically diverse groups, our Indigenous groups, and the LGBTIQ community. I think I've got to call that now the GST community. It's like the military, all the acronyms I'm learning. And finally, we've got to get smart about how we plan, fund and monitor and make people accountable for the services that are delivered around mental health in the community. So I'd just like to finish up with some key issues now that we've identified. What really came through clear is that people are getting lonelier and lonelier. And as we force the elderly, not force, but encourage older people to stay in their homes for as long as possible, they're getting lonely. We had one person in our consultations in a town, country town, gentleman came up and he said, I just wanted to chat with you people. I said, oh, that's great, look, let's have a chat. He said, yeah, I haven't spoken to a human for 13 days. And I thought, yeah, so he's living by himself out on a farm, came into town and just wanted someone to chat to. And in that typifies we've lost that community spirit. You know, the days where you watched what your next door neighbour was doing and you helped them out when you could, that you went round and saw your elderly parents or your grandparents and made sure they were all right. Quite how we rebuild that, I don't know, but it's going to be part of the strategic plan. The best place to treat people who are mentally unwell, not so much in the severe area, but in the other areas of mental ill health, is in the community. Because if someone knows that they've got a roof over their head, that they're going to get a meal that night, and that they know how they can earn $1, and they've got their community and their family around to support them, they're a long way to recovery. So keeping people in institutions or in hospitals is not the best place to have them, and they need to have that community support. I've already stressed that the need for greater emphasis on promotion, prevention and early intervention, and making sure everyone's involved in that, and the need to break down the stigma through awareness. And I can only repeat Adam's point before, is one thing I had the hardest thing to do was convince people not every veteran has PTS. But those that do have it, we've got to care for them and make sure that they get the best of treatment. The one thing that has really come through strongly is the importance of peer support workers, of that peer-to-peer support relationship. And a young lady explained it to me the best when she said, it's like when I was first pregnant, I got sat down with a young male gynaecologist and he told me exactly what I was going to experience through my pregnancy, through the childbirth and the years afterwards. And she said I walked out very, very confused. And she said she broke down in tears, and this lady came up to her and said, what's wrong? She said, I've just been told I'm pregnant, and the male gynaecologist has taught me through everything I'm going to go through. And she said, this woman sat down next to me, said, I've had 4 kids. Now I'll tell you what it's really like to go through childbirth. And that, to me, personifies the need for that peer support work. And this is where I see a really good space for veterans, because at the moment I believe the peer support workforce is an ad hoc thing. It's seen that it should only be volunteers, that they don't get any training, there's no selection criteria. I really want to push that we have a professionalised peer workforce where there is a selection criteria, because you can break people if you don't get the right people to do it, where they go through a qualification process, and it's not just one Cert 4 course at TAFE or a mental health first aid course. They have a hierarchy of training, that they have supervision, that they are credentialed, that they have a leadership stream and a career structure, and they are appropriately paid for what they do. Because the power of being able to put peer support workers in a school teaching kids resilience and being counsellors for them, in the courtrooms to help prisoners who are about to go and front a judge, to go into those prisons and help the prisoners, to go out into the workplace and help industry leaders to understand the mental health of their workforce, and even having peer workers sitting in the reception areas of a general practitioner's office, sitting down with the people before they see the GP, just talking through the issues with them before they go into the GP. And I see the veterans can be the model for that. They know and understand career structure, discipline training, and how to be part of a team and be mates. And I'd really like to see a veterans model around peer support workers. So we have produced our first copy of the plan, which will be a strategic direction document. As I said, I've only been in the job 12 months. That plan is currently in government for approval, and we hope to launch it on the 13th of October this year. It will be followed by a series of action plans that focus on key specific areas rather than try to eat the elephant in one sitting. But it won't surprise you that the first series of action plans will be about youth. Indeed, the first one I'm pushing for at the moment is preconception to 4 years old. So I hope that gave you an insight of what we're doing in South Australia around mental health and wellbeing, and thank you very much.